In this episode, I interview Ben Greenfield. Ben discusses topics including what recovery is from more than just a musculoskeletal standpoint. He also looks at recovery from a neurological viewpoint. We then dive into how you can change your recovery based on environmental factors. These are things that you can control. The main factors we touched on include nutrition supplementation through amino acids and how you can sleep better. Hope you enjoy this one.
The Prehab audio experience will teach you how to take control of your health through knowledge by optimizing performance, promoting longevity, and keeping your movement system in tune. Welcome to your host, the Prehab Guys.
Story, Ben. I didn't tell you this earlier, but I was listening to you on a podcast with Joe Rogan, and then me and my business partner Mike were actually doing some work out of Blue Jam Cafe in Santa Monica, and then I saw you walking right outside Blue Jam Cafe, and I was like, this is perfect. This is right when we started doing our IG lives, and I was like, let's get him on, and then that's when I reached out to you, and I'm glad this worked out. Yeah. That's awesome. But anyways, give people a little background of where your background is. I know your following knows, but for our following, where did you get your training from? I know you've done a ton of different things. Give people like a 10,000 foot view of what you've done and where you got to where you are today.
Just 10,000 feet, not 30,000 or 40,000.
Go as high as you want.
10,000 foot airplane, just flying at a relatively low altitude.
That's true.
I studied exercise physiology and biomechanics and nutrition at University of Idaho, and also played during my college days tennis, volleyball, and water polo, and kind of dabbled in bodybuilding. Since then, I've primarily shifted into endurance sports like Ironman triathlon, and I'm doing some professional obstacle course racing right now. Also, have a certification from the ISN in sports nutrition. I'm a CSCS certified strength conditioning coach with the NSCA, certified personal trainer, and spent about a decade doing primarily fitness training and nutrition consulting in Washington and Idaho, while racing pretty heavily in endurance sports. And since about 2009 or so, I've been doing a lot more kind of online consulting and distance consulting, a lot of speaking, a lot of writing, as well as a lot of podcasting over at bengreenfieldfitness.com, where I release most of my articles, most of my podcasts are over there. And then
ton of content on your website.
Yeah, and I do a lot of investing in kind of like the health and nutrition and fitness sectors, a lot of kind of consulting and advising for some businesses in those sectors. And then most of the folks who I coach and work with one-on-one, they're kind of a blend of pro athletes and then just executives. And the main things I pay attention to with those folks are, in addition to fuel and movement, really the couple of other things that I think really affect both longevity and performance, and that would be stress, in particular monitoring the autonomic nervous system, and HRV, or readiness to train, and then also sleep architecture, sleep cycling, sleep quality, etc. So yeah, that's what I do.
I think an easier question would have been, what haven't you done so far? That's impressive.
A lot. No politics. No opera.
No need for that. Yeah. No, that's really cool. Yeah, haven't published. Not yet. Okay, so that's awesome, and I think that leads into what I wanted to get into a discussion with you about is how to maximize recovery outside the gym, outside the clinic, outside of whatever environment you're using to create a physical stress response. And I wanted to at least define what recovery is. I know the three of us actually teach on blood flow restriction training across the nation, and we give people the breakdown between metabolic and mechanical stress. And oftentimes we look at markers like creatine kinase or lipid peroxides, but these are only looking at the musculoskeletal system. I know you've talked about from a neurological or inflammatory standpoint as well what recovery is. So why don't you break down to people what are we looking at with recovery? What is recovery?
Yeah, there's certainly a neuromuscular component and a biochemical component to recovery, in addition to simply mitigation of some of the musculoskeletal damage that occurs, reparation of a lot of the actin and myosin fibrils, and repair of muscle tissue overall and removal of inflammatory byproducts that have accumulated in muscle tissue really does fall under the category of recovery. Unfortunately, in many cases, if that's all an athlete is tracking is soreness or blood markers related to inflammation, you're missing out on some of the picture, because much of that inflammation and muscular damage in general can begin to subside within about 48 hours. Hence why a lot of times delayed onset muscle soreness will peak somewhere in that 24 to 48 hour window, at which point it begins to subside. But if you look at the reparation and recovery of the nervous system, which would involve rebuilding of some of the neurotransmitters, repletion of some of the ATP pools that can become exhausted or depleting, repletion of glycogen levels, and both repletion of glycogen levels and repletion of ATP kind of cross over into musculoskeletal recovery as well, but also would be considered under the branch of neuromuscular recovery. And then also, everything from repair of any type of damage to myelin sheaths or nerves, any type of autonomic nervous system downregulation of motor neuron recruitment, etc. All of that stuff that falls under the realm of neuromuscular recovery. And in many cases, if musculoskeletal recovery is occurring within 1 to 2 days, neuromuscular recovery is often anywhere from 2 to, for a significantly laborious effort, 4 to 5 days. And so that's one component that I think is certainly important to pay attention to, and that would be via the utilization of something that will track nervous system recovery, with the most popular, of course, these days being HRV, or heart rate variability, monitoring the sympathetic nervous system response and the parasympathetic nervous system response, and in particular looking at the interplay between both of those, which is referred to as the HF-LF ratios, with your high frequency score being a reflection of the parasympathetic activity, with the low frequency score being a measurement of the sympathetic nervous system activity, and with a high HF to LF ratio, or a high HRV, being indicative of enhanced neuromuscular recovery. So that's one component to pay attention to, in addition to musculoskeletal. And then just from a pure physiological standpoint, this kind of also crosses over into somewhat of what I've already named. You cannot ignore the importance of the nutritional aspect of recovery, in particular repletion of the ATP pools, which is accomplished via the utilization of either ATP precursors, such as creatine phosphate, which is remarkable for recovery and for sleep patterning, ATP, which is actually just something you can buy in supplemental form, food or calorie, in the form of carbons, which of course can be used to replenish ATP, and then even some lesser known molecules that can more rapidly replenish ATP, such as D-ribose or amino acids, for example. And then also, of course, glycogen, which, as your storage liver and muscle carbohydrate stores, is typically repleted pretty quickly. I mean, even in the absence of post-workout nutrition, typically within about 8 hours, just by eating ad libitum, your carbohydrate stores, your glycogen levels are topped off. so that you can kind of return and dig into those again, which is why, I think, and maybe a little bit of a rabbit hole here, aside from, the athlete participating in two-a-day practices, or the athlete who might be in a multiple performance per day, like a volleyball or tennis or a water polo competition, for example, where you do have multiple matches spread across the course of the day. I think sometimes post-workout nutrition is too heavily overemphasized, because there is some data that not only do you see some beneficial cellular autophagy mechanisms kick in by skipping the post-workout meal if it's not necessary, and by just waiting until whenever your next real meal, breakfast, lunch, or dinner, happens to fall. But it also may enhance a little bit the growth hormone and testosterone response, the endocrine response to a workout, by actually engaging in just a little bit of post-workout fasting. And so that's kind of an interesting consideration too, is the hormonal system and the endocrine response to recovery. So those are just a few of the things to consider. In addition to musculoskeletal recovery, be neuromuscular recovery, and then also recovery of any of the nutrients required for the nutrient pool for the next exercise session, and then also hormonal or endocrine system recovery.
Perfect. That's a very comprehensive response. And then going back to heart rate variability, what's your favorite way to track that? I know I've experienced with the Whoop band. I'm not sure if you have a specific way that you like to track the balance between the sympathetic fight or flight nervous system versus the parasympathetic rest and digestion nervous system.
Well, for gold standard and what would be reflective of what's used in clinical research, you still need the chest lead, meaning anything that has a Bluetooth-enabled chest heart rate monitor, and some of the better signals you're going to get from like the Polar H6 chest strap, or there's a company called Viva that makes a pretty good one, VIIIVA, and typically those are communicating your heart rhythms, and what's technically your sinus arrhythmias to a device, usually an app, right? So there are apps like Elite HRV or Sweetbeat or NatureBeat or BioForce. I think it's BioForce. Any of these different apps are picking up signals from the heart rate monitor, and the gold standard for heart rate variability measurements is supine in bed in the morning for a 3 to 5 minute measurement to determine the nervous system's readiness to train for that day. That's what the lion's share of HRV research is done with. That being said, that's inconvenient, and also it's difficult sometimes for an athlete in training to get real-time data if they're competing and can't have, say, like, usually the chest strap isn't a game changer or a deal breaker, but having your phone or a receiver on your body and close enough to that chest strap to be able to receive a signal can be difficult if you're, say, in a football scrimmage. So in a case like that, that's where some of these more convenient portable self-quantification devices can give you a pretty good approximation of what you get from a Bluetooth-enabled chest strap. So, for example, I've used the Whoop before. That doesn't give you bad data at all. I use the Oura Ring as well, which I'm wearing right now, which takes 12 5-minute samplings of HRV during a night of sleep. And so either of those, I like the Whoop in that during an exercise session, you can get some amount of real-time HRV data. And that can be useful for the exact opposite reasons that you gather HRV data during sleep or while you're laying in bed in the morning. Namely, that sleep HRV or in bed in the morning HRV, you're measuring that primarily to see, am I unstressed, right? Is my nervous system repaired and recovered? Has my sympathetic nervous system score down-regulated enough and the parasympathetic nervous score risen to the point where my body can handle a heavier training load today? Or if I push through this low HRV, am I increasing risk, as is the case, of illness or injury if I push through a low HRV score, or am I simply going to be engaging in functional overreaching when it's really not necessary, when it's really not part of my training program at this point in my training program to overreach. And don't get me wrong, there are times when you purposefully want to lower HRV because you're purposefully trying to achieve a state of functional overreaching so that you can then super compensate and then taper for a competition, or rest and recover for a race or a competition. When you're measuring during an exercise session, however, in my opinion, the most value to measuring HRV during a session would be to monitor the effectiveness of any given exercise or movement pattern to see if it elicits a rise in sympathetic nervous system activity. Like, for example, I've measured my HRV in real time during a workout, and there is nothing that plummets the HRV as much as a back squat or running uphill. Both of those activities are highly stressful to the human body, and almost from an evolutionary standpoint, call upon these survival mechanisms that massively activate the sympathetic nervous system. So you can say, well, this is a good exercise for me because it's resulting in a steep drop in HRV and a steep rise in sympathetic nervous system activity. So that'd be one useful way to measure it. And then also for predictiveness. And, for example, if you could give a NASCAR driver a real-time HRV measurement tool and predict, okay, well, we've noticed a steep drop in HRV 10 seconds prior to an accident occurring, or that driver weaving off the road or making some mistake that affects their performance, well, then you can go back to the drawing board and train accordingly, or be able to nip that in the bud if it were about to occur. So in my opinion, in competition data and also in training data does have some applicability, and that would be in addition to just recovery data.
Yeah, that's cool. Someone here asked a question, and we'll answer questions as long as they're relatable to the topic that we're discussing. By the Modrast guy, squatting is resting and response in a way of fight or fight body position. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I think going off of Ben's point, you do want to sometimes stress the nervous system to allow for supercompensation and to allow for that adaptation. I know, Ben, you've talked about where something that may be, or you talk about how the dose can be the poison, right? Where if you have too much of something, that's where you can actually have a deleterious effect, versus if you have a right amount, and this is a way to objectively measure this, you can allow the body to supercompensate, right? So it's a matter of making sure you find the optimal amount of physical stress that you're putting your body under, and then you can slowly overload from there.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and let's go into nutrition. I know this is the area of knowledge that I have probably the least amount that I've heard you talk about, and I think that a lot of probably both of our audiences can benefit from this. I know you talked about some amino acids. In terms of the way that I lecture with BFR, I barely touch on this. I just talk about leucine supplementation and how that leucine can help improve muscle protein synthesis. And I want you to talk about the amino acid spectrum, I guess, because I know you've came out with very interesting product, Keon, that has an amino acid blend built into it. And I want to see just in general where the evidence is with amino acids, and how you maximize amino acids to allow for someone to maximize their recovery.
Yeah, in brief, branched-chain amino acids that would include a blend of typically leucine, isoleucine, and valine, I'm not a huge fan of, in particular because of the leucine component, which has been shown to potentially cause some amount of insulin insensitivity and rise in blood glucose, which I don't think is detrimental from a performance standpoint, but from a health or a longevity standpoint may not be the best thing to do when it comes to amino acids, primarily just due to long-term effects on insulin and glucose levels. Now, that being said, it appears that if the levels of leucine, isoleucine, and valine are balanced out by including them in a blend of all 9 of the essential amino acids, you tend not to see the same results in terms of glucose or insulin dysregulation. And in addition to that, you're getting more of the building blocks for muscle repair and recovery, or for gut repair and recovery, or for collagen, elastin formation, etc., with all 9 essential amino acids rather than just the 3 branched chain amino acids. In addition to that, when it comes for competition with the amino acid tryptophan across the blood-brain barrier, which is something that's going to occur during harder, longer exercise bouts in which skeletal muscle is catabolized, and some of that is in the bloodstream, and some of that tryptophan crosses the blood-brain barrier. What you're going to experience in a case like that is something very similar to glycogen depletion, or the infamous carbohydrate-based bonk, which is some amount of central nervous system fatigue. And so the use of some kind of essential amino acid blend during exercise allows for competition against tryptophan across the blood-brain barrier and a staving off of central nervous system fatigue, along with the remarkable decrease in soreness after the activity, because you're essentially tapping into the amino acids you'd be deriving from skeletal muscle less, because your blood levels of amino acids are higher. And so, that all being said, a dosage range of somewhere in the realm of 5 to 10 grams of essential amino acids for athletes during extended exercise periods, a redosing every hour of another 5 to 10 grams of essential amino acids, and then finally a final dosing of about 5 to 10 grams after activity has completed is, in my opinion, a very, very smart way to utilize amino acids. And that's something any of the athletes I coach and myself use for competition. And of course, there are a lot of people out there nowadays who are trying to exercise in a fasted state to take advantage of the cellular autophagy and the potential increase in beta oxidation or post-exercise RER, like a drop in post-exercise RER, or increase in fat burning that can elicit, but who also do not want to lose an appreciable amount of muscle in the process. And because an essential amino acid blend, unlike a branched chain amino acid blend, is relatively non-insulinogenic, it's something that can be used prior to exercise in a fasted state to be able to kind of have your cake and eat it too, so to speak, because you are increasing your blood levels of amino acids, staving off catabolism, not down-regulating cellular autophagy appreciably, and not seeing any rampant fluctuations in glucose or insulin. So I am a fan of essential amino acids.
For the technical difficulty, let's go ahead and continue with what you were finishing off with, Ben, in terms of the nutritional aspect. And I know you're finishing up on discussing about the amino acid profile.
Yes. I believe when the audio started to have difficulty, I was replying to your question about if someone should use amino acids outside of training and just during the day in general. And my remark to that was that because essential amino acids can be expensive, the only population for whom I think that would be really a good idea would be if someone is trying to get appreciable amounts of protein without an appreciable amount of calories, meaning someone who, say, they've done a urinary amino acids test and noted that they had low levels of neurotransmitters, which require amino acids as their precursors, or low levels of amino acids, or both. And that person is also trying to maintain weight or to lose weight or to lose fat. Well, in that case, essential amino acids could be used to replenish the amino acid or the neurotransmitter pool without many calories, because compared to whey protein or steak or eggs or anything like that, amino acids do not have many calories. So for someone like that, they could continue to cycle amino acids throughout the day if they were just trying to keep their protein levels elevated without taking on a large number of calories.
That makes sense. And then each serving, you were saying roughly about 5 to 10 grams of essential, or not even BCAAs, but all 9 essential amino acids, ideally.
My recommendation for most of the athletes I work with for recovery is the equivalent of either 40 grams of collagen per day or 20 grams of amino acids, or any combination thereof. So you could, for example, do 10 grams of amino acids with 30 grams of collagen, or you could do 35 grams of collagen and 5 grams of amino acids, whatever it takes. But ultimately, I get the best recovery results from a protein and a collagen standpoint with that recommendation of either 40 of collagen or 20 of amino acids.
Gotcha. Does Keon have their own collagen supplementation as well?
No, I consider amino acids to be superior enough to collagen to where I haven't even toyed around with collagen, just because I've already got what I consider to be the perfect blend for bioavailability when it comes to amino acids. So that's not to say I couldn't come out with a meal replacement in the future that just from an affordability standpoint for people would have collagen in it. But at this point, I'm just pretty sold on amino acids.
Gotcha. Very cool. All right. So last point I wanted you to touch on, we know that there's a significant increase in risk that we see with decrease in sleep amounts. It seemed that actually this new research from 2014 seemed to show that 6 hours of sleep was the most detrimental, 7 being less, and then 8 being optimal. And you have a 70% increase in risk of injury if you get less than 8 hours of sleep. And I've heard you talk about sleep, and obviously we know it's important, but what are a few tips that you can give people on how to make sure they get the best quality of sleep possible?
Sure. I'm just going to list a few for you, and I certainly do have some pretty big sleep articles on my website and in my book, Beyond Training, where people can take a deeper dive. But from an exercise standpoint, finish up any hard exercise sessions 3 hours prior to bedtime if you don't want to deleteriously impact deep sleep. If you do exercise within 3 hours of bedtime, take a cold shower or do hot-cold contrast afterwards to decrease the core temperature that's still going to be elevated while you sleep. In addition to that, when it comes to temperature, it's really important. 64 to 66 degrees Fahrenheit in the room that you're sleeping is the sweet spot for repair and recovery during sleep and for activating good deep sleep cycles. In addition to that, if you can afford something called a chili pad that will circulate cold water under your body while you're asleep, that's smart, as is preferably sleeping nude with a low amount of blanketing over the body, with the only exception of that being some of these new weighted blankets, which are also known as gravity blankets, seem to help quite a few people sleep. So like a top sheet with a gravity blanket on top of that in a cold room can be a pretty good idea. Absence of light, in particular, replacing any light bulbs in the sleeping area with red incandescent bulbs, which simulate torchlight or firelight. That's a very good idea. I don't really need to repeat the all too common mantra these days of not laying in bed and looking at your phone, your computer, your e-reader. But if you do, at least have night mode activated and preferably also be wearing some kind of blue light blocking glasses. Your sleep architecture begins in the morning, so get as much natural sunlight or blue light, like blue artificial light, the same stuff you're trying to avoid at night. Get as much of that as freaking possible before noon, sunlight and or blue or artificial light. Eliminate any noise in the bedroom. I like foam earplugs combined with noise producing device. Like there's an app called Sleep Stream that works pretty well. Of all the different noises, from pink noise to brown noise to white noise that are out there, pink noise seems to be the best when it comes to activating deep sleep. And then I would also recommend, if you're going to use supplements prior to sleep, the one that I like best for activating deep sleep would just be slightly higher dose CBD, somewhere in the range of 60 to 100 milligrams of CBD. Whereas THC seems to deleteriously impact sleep architecture, CBD seems to help it out quite a bit. If you find yourself waking frequently during the night, anything that has gamma aminobutyric acid precursors in it or GABA precursors in it, such as valerian root or passion flower extract, or even just a straight up GABA supplement, any of these can help you fall back to sleep if you find yourself waking frequently during the night. And then the last thing that I would recommend would be, if you're like me and a realistic sleep cycle really allows you to get maybe 6.5 to 7.5 hours of sleep during the night, you can replicate a full sleep cycle with about a 20 to 40 minute power nap performed at some point during the day. And it appears based on literature, the best time of day to nap is typically somewhere in the range of about 6 to 8 hours after you've woken, right? So if you get up at 6 a.m. frequently, your sweet spot for napping would be sometime between 12 p.m. and 2 p.m. And that's a very, very good strategy for people who can't quite get enough sleep during the night, but still want to achieve that full kind of 8 to 9 hours of sleep for any 24-hour sleep cycle.
Awesome. That was great. Quick follow-up question with that. What are your thoughts on melatonin for sleep? I know that's a big common one.
Yeah. Well, melatonin not only can activate some elements of sleep architecture, but actually act as a mitochondrial protectant and mitochondrial antioxidant. So I like it, only in small doses though. So I'm talking like 0.3 milligrams or so of melatonin. So your body continues its own endogenous production. More melatonin than that seems to result in a rebound waking at some point during the night when the large dose of melatonin wears off. The only exception to that rule of microdosing with melatonin would be for pretty hefty west to east travel, in which case a higher dose of melatonin on the first night, if you've traveled from, let's say, Seattle to London, can be pretty beneficial. And I'm talking in that case anywhere from 10 up to as much as 50 milligrams of melatonin, just a very large bolus on that first night. You'll be groggy the next day, but that seems to do a good job kind of resetting the sleep cycle and speeding up the circadian rhythm adaptations to longer kind of long haul travel.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially with how short the half-life is of a supplement like melatonin. Cool.
Yeah.
Like you said, there's a ton of content on your website. Why don't you tell people a little bit more about where they can follow up with content on you through social media or your website? Where can they find you?
Yeah, you can just go to bengreenfieldfitness.com for all my podcasts and my articles. If you want to check out those amino acids or any of the other supplements that I formulate, you can go to getkion.com. That's getkion.com. And then finally, my book is called Beyond Training, and you can find that at beyondtrainingbook.com.
Cool. All right, Ben, I appreciate your time. Thanks for hopping on. I learned a lot. I'm sure a lot of listeners also learned a lot. I'll stay in touch. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me on, man. Appreciate it.
All right, Ben.
Catch you on the side.
Definitely. Later. We'll take it easy. Hopefully you guys learned something. I know I did. Ben gave a ton of different actionable items that you can take today. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. This helps us tremendously and allows us to get our brand across and educate more people through these podcast platforms. And if there's any other guests that you want us to interview, please let us know. We're trying to get more of these podcasts going. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in.